There is a passage in the book of Exodus so precise, so deliberately constructed, that generations of Jewish scholars refuse to teach it in public. 3 consecutive verses, 72 letters in each one. Exactly 72, 3 times in a row, as if the text itself were a lock built from language. When those letters are extracted in a specific sequence and arranged in a particular order, they produce something that has no equivalent in any other religious tradition on earth. 72 distinct names, each one believed to represent a different frequency of the divine, each one said to have been used by angels long before a single human being ever drew breath. Picture the scene. A desert at night, somewhere between Egypt and a land not yet reached. A pillar of fire standing between an army and a people. The air thick with something that cannot be named. And in that suspended moment, according to the oldest layers of Jewish mysticism, the divine presence moved through language itself, through a sequence of sounds so precise that the fabric of reality responded. The rabbis who studied this passage did not treat it as poetry. They treated it as engineering. Sacred, terrifying, and in the wrong hands, catastrophically dangerous engineering. For thousands of years, the 72 names were protected with a silence so deliberate it was almost violent. Students were told they could be studied, but never spoken carelessly. Scrolls containing their arrangement were kept from the uninitiated, not out of religious snobbery, but out of something closer to genuine fear. Because embedded in the oral traditions, in the corners of the Talmud, in the layered architecture of the Zohar, there is a story about what happened when someone broke that silence. A man who knew the names. A man who used them. And a fate so severe that the tradition preserved his memory, not as a warning about arrogance, but as a warning about the names themselves. What follows is not a religious lecture. It is a reconstruction drawn from texts that most people never encounter of one of the oldest and most carefully guarded secrets in the history of human spirituality. The 72 names of God that angels used before humans existed. The knowledge that was never meant to cross from one world into this one. And the story of the first man who carried that knowledge across anyway and discovered too late exactly why the boundary had been drawn. There is a moment in the book of Exodus that most people read and immediately move past. It sits in chapter 14, verses 19 through 21. And on the surface, it looks like a straightforward description of the parting of the Red Sea. 3 verses. A pillar of cloud moving behind the Israelites. The angel of God repositioning itself. The waters dividing. Most readers absorb the miracle and turn the page, but Jewish scholars who dedicated their lives to the structure of the Hebrew text noticed something that cannot be accidental, something so precise that it demands an entirely different kind of attention. Each of those 3 verses contains exactly 72 Hebrew letters, not approximately, not in some manuscripts, and not in others. Exactly 72 in every authenticated version of the text across thousands of years of transmission. Now stop for a moment and think about what that means. The Hebrew language does not work like English. Letters are not interchangeable decorations around meaning. In the Hebrew tradition, each letter carries numerical value, spiritual weight, and a position in a divine architecture that was understood long before the printing press made texts disposable. When a passage contains a structural pattern that precise, it is not a coincidence. It is a code. And the scholars who first identified this code, the Kabbalists of medieval Spain and the ancient rabbis whose oral traditions predated them by centuries, understood immediately what they were looking at. Those 3 verses, read in a specific sequence, with letters extracted in a method passed down through generations of initiated teachers, produce exactly 72 letter combinations, 72 names. And according to the tradition, those names were not invented by human beings. They were revealed, transmitted, descended from a realm where language and reality are not separate things. The Kabbalistic framework that surrounds these names is not simple mysticism dressed up in poetic language. It is a highly detailed, internally consistent system of thought that treats the universe as a structure built from divine speech. In the beginning, according to the opening verses of Genesis, God did not build the world with hands or materials. God spoke. The Hebrew word for this creative act is not a casual one. The tradition insists that the sounds themselves were the mechanism, that the specific frequencies of divine language shaped matter out of nothing. The 72 names in this framework are not descriptions of God. They are operating instructions. Each name corresponds to a specific emanation, a specific gate, a specific force within the architecture of creation. The angels, who existed before humanity, navigated creation using these names the way a sailor navigates by stars. They were the original language of a reality that humans were only later permitted to enter. Guarda esa pregunta, because what comes next is where this stops being abstract theology and starts becoming something far more unsettling. The tradition does not simply say that these names exist and were used by angels. It says they were given to human beings under very specific conditions, through a transmission that came with warnings so severe they bordered on threats. The rabbis who discussed this material in the Talmud did not speak about the 72 names the way they spoke about most sacred knowledge. They spoke about them the way you speak about something that has already caused damage. There is a weight in the language, a carefulness in how the discussion is framed that suggests these names were not merely powerful in theory. They had been tested, and the results of those tests were not forgotten. The method for extracting the names from those 3 verses is called the boustrophodon method, a term that comes from the Greek description of how an ox plows a field, back and forth in alternating directions. The first verse is read left to right, as Hebrew normally flows. The second verse is read right to left, reversing the direction. The third verse returns to left to right. From each position across all 3 verses, a 3-letter combination is drawn. And when all 72 combinations are assembled, you hold in your hands what the tradition calls the Shem Hamphorish, the explicit name, the name that contains all other names within it. The precision required to extract this correctly was considered so demanding that teachers refused to commit the method to writing for centuries. It was transmitted orally, teacher to student, in private, with deliberate gaps left in the instruction for any student whose character was judged insufficient for the knowledge. This was not elitism. It was engineering safety. You do not hand the instructions for a nuclear reaction to someone who has not yet learned why fire burns. And here is what the tradition says about why that caution was so absolute. The 72 names are not passive. They are not decorative labels for spiritual concepts that sit inertly on a page. According to the Zohar, the central text of Kabbalistic teaching, compiled in 13th century Spain, but drawing on traditions far older, each name activates a specific connection between the human world and the divine structure underlying it. To speak a name correctly, with proper intention and proper understanding of its position in the architecture of creation, is to reach through the membrane between the visible and the invisible and pull something across. What gets pulled across depends entirely on which name is used, how it is used, and whether the person using it has the spiritual and moral foundation to handle what responds. The tradition is explicit on this point in a way that most modern readers find startling. The names can be used for healing, for protection, for the resolution of impossible situations. But they can also be catastrophically misused, and the line between those two outcomes is not always obvious until it is too late. This is why the question of who first revealed these names to humanity matters so deeply. Because the 72 names did not simply appear in a text one day for anyone to read and use as they pleased. According to the oldest layers of Jewish mystical tradition, they entered human knowledge through a transmission that was partly authorized and partly a transgression. There were beings who carried this knowledge. There were humans who received it. And there was, somewhere in that exchange, a first moment when the boundary was crossed in a way that could not be uncrossed. The rabbis remembered that moment. The texts preserved it in fragments, in allusions, in stories told carefully enough to transmit the warning without transmitting the method to anyone who was not already initiated. The story of that first crossing is not a comfortable one. It does not resolve into a lesson about the importance of humility or a parable about overreaching ambition. It resolves into something far stranger and far more specific than that, and to understand it, you need to understand first what these names actually are, where they came from before Exodus, and what kind of reality they were designed to navigate. Before there were humans, before there was a garden, before there was a sky or a sea or a name for either of those things, there was language. Not the kind of language you use to order food or argue with a stranger. Not even the kind you use to write poetry or frame a law. The tradition that surrounds the 72 names insists on something that modern ears find deeply strange. That language is not a tool invented by conscious beings to describe a reality that already exists. Language, in the framework of ancient Jewish mysticism, is the mechanism by which reality was constructed in the first place. The divine speech recorded in the opening verses of Genesis was not a metaphor for a creative process that happened through some other means. The speaking was the process. The words were the architecture, and the beings who existed before humanity, the angels, the celestial messengers, the ones the Hebrew text calls malachim, lived inside that language the way fish live inside water, not using it from the outside, but constituted by it from within. The Hebrew word for angel, malach, carries a meaning that most translations flatten into invisibility. It does not simply mean a winged being of light who delivers messages and looks impressive in paintings. The root of the word describes a function, a purpose, a role within a larger system. An angel In the oldest layers of the tradition is a specific expression of divine will given temporary form. Each one corresponds to a particular operation within the structure of creation. And the names, the divine names, the frequencies of sacred language that predate human existence, were the medium through which those operations were carried out. When an angel acted in the world, it did so through a name. When creation responded to a divine command, it responded through a name. The 72 names were not a list that someone compiled later and attributed to angels for dramatic effect. They were, according to this framework, the operational vocabulary of a reality that existed long before the first human eye opened to see it. Now here is where the tradition becomes more specific and more difficult. The Kabbalistic system describes creation not as a single flat event, but as a cascade, a series of emanations descending from a source that is, by definition, beyond description. The Hebrew term for this is tzimtzum, the contraction, the moment in which the infinite withdrew into itself to create the space in which a finite universe could exist. From that contraction, 10 emanations flowed outward, what the tradition calls the Sephirot, 10 distinct qualities or dimensions of divine expression arranged in a structure that the Zohar describes with almost architectural precision. Each of the 72 names corresponds to a specific position within that structure, a specific combination of qualities, a specific frequency at which divine energy moves through the created world. The angels did not simply know these names the way you know a phone number. They were, in a very real sense, expressions of those names. Their existence and the names were not two separate things. This is the framework that makes the idea of revealing these names to humanity so charged, so dangerous, and according to the tradition, so consequential. Human beings were created at the intersection of two worlds, the physical and the spiritual, fashioned from the dust of the earth and animated by the breath of the divine. The Hebrew phrase used in Genesis 2, verse 7, is nishmat chayim, the breath of life. And the rabbis who parsed that phrase carefully noted that the word nishmat shares its root with neshama, the soul, the deepest level of human spiritual identity. Humanity was built as a bridge between realms, but a bridge is designed to carry traffic in a controlled way, with weight limits and structural tolerances. The 72 names were not designed for the bridge. They were designed for the realm on the other side of it. Giving them to human beings was not like handing someone a key to a room they had not yet entered. It was like handing someone a key to a room that the architecture of their body had not yet been built to survive. The tradition distinguishes carefully between two kinds of divine names. There are names that describe God in relation to creation, names that capture qualities like mercy, judgment, sovereignty, and presence. These names fill the pages of Scripture and the words of prayer. They are given freely, transmitted openly, taught to children. Then there are names that do not describe God from the outside, but participate in divine action from the inside. Names that are not labels, but levers. The 72 names belong to this second category, and the tradition's anxiety about them is not metaphorical. The Talmudic tractate known as Kiddushin records a discussion among rabbis about who is permitted to transmit the explicit name, and the language used is not the language of academic caution. It is the language of people who have seen what happens when the transmission goes wrong. The student must be tested, the teacher must be certain, And even then, the transmission is partial, deliberately incomplete, because the full name in the full sequence is considered too powerful to exist in any single human mind. But why? What is it about these specific combinations of letters that generate such profound caution in traditions that are otherwise remarkably comfortable with complexity and deep knowledge? The answer, according to the oldest commentaries, is that the 72 names do not operate on the level of meaning. They operate on the level of structure. When you speak a word in ordinary language, the word points to something beyond itself. The word tree points to trees. The word love points to love. But the 72 names do not point to anything. They are, in the technical language of the tradition, not signifiers, but operators. Speaking one correctly, with the proper intention and the proper understanding, does not describe a reality. It modifies one. And modifying reality at the level of its divine structure is not something that human consciousness, still anchored to a physical body with physical limitations and physical fears, can do without consequences that ripple far beyond the intended effect. Imagine handing a child a surgical scalpel and explaining that with the right movement, at the right angle, applied to the right place, it can save a life. Everything in that sentence is true. The scalpel can save a life. But without the years of training, without the deep understanding of the body's architecture, without the capacity to read what is happening beneath the surface and adjust in real time, the same instrument that saves can destroy. The 72 names are, in this analogy, the scalpel. And the human beings who first received them were not surgeons. They were something more like patients who had been handed the instruments of their own operation and told to proceed. The angels who used these names did so as natural expressions of their function within creation. For a human being to use them was to reach for a power whose weight the human frame was never designed to bear alone. And yet, according to the tradition, someone reached. Someone took what was not yet meant to be taken. And the story of that reaching and what it cost is preserved in fragments that most people never encounter, scattered across texts that sit at the outer edges of the canon, waiting to be read together for the first time. His name was Ben Stada, or perhaps it was Ben Pandira. The Talmud uses both names, sometimes in the same passage, as if the tradition itself is uncertain whether to remember him clearly or to keep him deliberately blurred at the edges of history. What the texts agree on is this: he was a man who entered Egypt, and he came back with something he should not have had. The rabbis who recorded his story did so in the compressed, elusive language that the Talmudic tradition uses when it wants to preserve a warning. Without providing a manual, they did not write his story as a celebration. They did not write it as a simple condemnation either. They wrote it the way you write about something that actually happened, something whose consequences were real enough that the memory needed to be kept, even if the details needed to be kept incomplete. And embedded in those incomplete details is an account of the first human being to extract divine names from a protected transmission and use them outside the boundaries for which they were intended. The method attributed to Ben Stada in the Talmudic account is specific enough to be disturbing. According to the tractate Shabbat, he scratched the names onto his skin, concealing them beneath flesh so that they could not be confiscated at the border. Egypt, in the rabbinic imagination, was not simply a geographical location. It was the world capital of a particular kind of knowledge, a place where the manipulation of divine names and sacred forces had been practiced for generations, where the priests of the great temples had developed a sophisticated technology of spiritual power that the tradition viewed with a combination of horror and reluctant respect. The plagues of Exodus were not simply miraculous events in this reading. They were a confrontation between two systems of knowledge, one authorized and one transgressive, and the authorized system won. But the knowledge that the Egyptian priests had accumulated did not disappear when Pharaoh's army drowned in the sea. It remained, and Ben Stada went looking for it. What he found, or what he brought back, the texts describe as the ability to perform acts that no human being should have been able to perform through natural means. The word the tradition uses for these acts is significant. It does not use the Hebrew word for miracles, which is reserved for divine intervention. It uses a word that carries the weight of something accomplished through technique, through a method that was learned and applied rather than received as a gift. Ben Stada had acquired a technology, and the core of that technology, according to the rabbis who examined his case with the careful attention of people trying to understand a dangerous precedent, was his access to divine names that had not been transmitted to him through any legitimate chain of teaching. He had not received them from a teacher who received them from a teacher who traced the line back to Sinai. He had extracted them from a system that was never designed to deliver them to human hands at all, and in doing so, he had crossed a line that the tradition would spend centuries trying to define precisely because of what his crossing revealed about where the line actually was. Now, think carefully about what this story is actually claiming. It is not claiming that Ben Stada invented something dangerous. It is not claiming that he discovered a new power that had not existed before. It is claiming that he accessed something ancient, something structural, something that had been deliberately withheld from humanity, not because humanity was unworthy in some abstract moral sense, but because the architecture of human consciousness, the specific way that human minds process intention and consequence and reality, was not yet calibrated to handle what those names could do when spoken with knowledge and will. The rabbis understood this distinction. A knife is not evil. A nuclear reaction is not evil. But both of them, in hands that lack the specific knowledge required to use them correctly, produce outcomes that cannot be undone. Ben Stada had the names. What he did not have, what no human being in his era could have had, was the full understanding of what the names connected to on the other end of their operation. He was pulling levers in a room he could not fully see. The fate recorded for Ben Stada in the tradition is severe, and to modern ears, deeply uncomfortable. The texts record that he was brought before a court and executed not for fraud, not for deception, not for any of the crimes that a modern legal framework would recognize, but for the specific act of practicing what the tradition calls kishuf, a Hebrew term usually translated as sorcery, but which carries a more precise meaning in its original context. Kishuf, in the rabbinic understanding, is not the performance of impossible tricks for entertainment or personal gain. It is the unauthorized use of divine forces, the manipulation of the structural fabric of reality through means that were not sanctioned by the legitimate transmission of sacred knowledge. The crime was not the power itself. The crime was the source of the power and the absence of the authorization that should have accompanied it. Ben Stada had not received what he used, he had taken it. And in a framework where the names are not tools, but living connections to the divine structure of creation, taking without authorization is not merely theft. It is a rupture in the fabric that those names were meant to maintain. But here is what the tradition does not say loudly enough, what sits in the margins of the discussion like a presence that no one wants to name directly. Ben Stada was not the only one implicated in what happened. The names he accessed did not come from nowhere. They came from a transmission that had already been broken before he arrived in Egypt. Someone or something had already moved knowledge across the boundary that separated the angelic realm from the human one. The Egyptian priests did not generate the technology of divine names from pure human ingenuity. The tradition is clear on this point, even when it is indirect about it. The knowledge that Ben Stada found waiting for him in Egypt was already there, because an earlier transgression had placed it there, a transgression that predated Ben Stada by generations, that predated Egypt as a civilization, that reached back to a moment in the early history of the world, when beings who were not human decided to share with human beings something that the divine order had specifically reserved for a later time, or perhaps for no time at all. The question of who made that first transfer, and why, and what it cost them, is not answered in the story of Ben Stada. It is only gestured toward a shadow behind the shadow of the man who scratched names into his own skin and carried them across a border that was never meant to be crossed by anyone carrying what he carried. There is a book that almost made it into the Bible. It was quoted directly in the letter of Jude, referenced in the second letter of Peter, and treated as authoritative scripture by the early Christian church in Ethiopia, where it has been preserved in the biblical canon for over 1,500 years. The Book of Enoch is not a fringe document produced by a marginal sect. It is one of the oldest Jewish texts in existence outside the Hebrew Bible itself, and fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning that the community at Qumran, one of the most rigorous and disciplined religious communities of the ancient world, considered it worth copying and preserving with the same care they gave to the Torah. And at the center of the Book of Enoch is a story that changes everything about how you understand the question of where forbidden knowledge came from, and who decided to bring it across the boundary that separated the divine realm from the human one. The story begins in the days before the flood, in an era that the text describes with a specificity that feels almost like journalism. 200 beings, called the Watchers, or in Hebrew, the Irin, descended to a mountain called Hermon. The name Hermon is not incidental. In Hebrew, the root of the word carries the meaning of an oath, a sacred ban, a prohibition. The mountain where these beings descended was named in the tradition for the very concept of the boundary they were crossing. They came down. They made a pact among themselves, swearing that none of them would turn back from what they had decided to do. And what they had decided to do was teach, not preach, not inspire. Teach, in the most specific and technical sense of that word. They identified human beings as the recipients of a transmission that had never been authorized from above, and they began to transfer knowledge that the divine order had placed in the category of the reserved, the not yet, or perhaps the never. The list of what the Watchers taught is preserved in the Book of Enoch with a precision that reads less like mythology and more like an indictment. Azazel, taught the making of weapons and the art of war. Shemyaza taught the manipulation of roots and the cutting of enchantments. Arachiel taught the signs of the earth. Kokabiel taught the knowledge of the stars. Sariel taught the motion of the moon. And scattered through the list, described with the same matter-of-fact tone used for metallurgy and astronomy, is the transmission of divine names, not the names used in ordinary prayer or common blessing. The names that belong to the operational vocabulary of creation itself. The same names that the angelic host used to navigate the structure of a reality they had helped to maintain since before humanity existed. The Watchers did not simply introduce human beings to esoteric knowledge as a philosophical gift. They handed over the instruments of divine action to beings who had not been prepared to receive them in a world that had not been designed to contain them. Now ask yourself why. This is the question that the text raises and then answers in a way that most casual readers find surprising. The Book of Enoch does not present the Watchers as evil beings who descended out of malice or a desire to corrupt. It presents them as beings who were overwhelmed by something far more recognizable than malice. The text says they saw the daughters of men and desired them. That desire, whatever its precise, led to a decision, and the decision led to a transmission. The knowledge of divine names was not the primary objective of the descent. It was part of the package, part of what happened when beings who were constituted by divine language entered into a relationship with human beings and began gradually to share what they were. The names leaked across the boundary the way heat leaks through a wall, not all at once, not in a single deliberate act of disclosure, but steadily, irreversibly, until the human world contained something it had never been built to hold. The consequences described in the Book of Enoch are not subtle. The earth filled with corruption. The text uses a word that appears again in Genesis chapter 6, verse 11, the same word that triggers the decision for the flood. The Hebrew is tishachet, a word that means not merely moral failure, but structural degradation, the kind of corruption that compromises the integrity of a thing at its foundation. The knowledge of the divine names in the hands of human beings who lacked the angelic constitution required to use them responsibly did not simply lead to a few people doing bad things. It led to a transformation of the human world at a level so fundamental that the divine response was not a correction, but a reset. And here is what the tradition insists you understand about that reset. It was not primarily a punishment for wickedness in the ordinary sense. It was a structural intervention in a system that had been destabilized by the introduction of elements it was not designed to contain. The flood was not revenge. It was surgery. The connection between the Watchers and the 72 names becomes clearer when you examine what happened to the knowledge after the flood. It did not disappear. The tradition is unanimous on this point, and it is one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire story. The names that the Watchers transmitted to humanity survived the flood the way seeds survive a winter, dormant, dispersed, embedded in the memories and practices of the cultures that descended from the survivors. The civilization that arose in the Mesopotamian valley after the waters receded carried fragments of Watcher knowledge in its priesthood. Egypt, which the tradition views as the great repository of pre-flood wisdom, preserved those fragments in the practices of its temple priests. The specific combination of divine names that Ben Stada found waiting for him in Egypt was not an Egyptian invention. It was a survival, a remnant of a transmission that had taken place before the flood, passed down through generations of initiates who understood enough of what they had to know it was dangerous, but not enough to know they should have let it disappear. And this is where the story of the Watchers stops being ancient history and starts pressing against the present with uncomfortable force. The Book of Enoch ends its account of the Watchers not with their punishment alone, but with a promise, or depending on how you read it, a warning. The knowledge they transmitted was not fully extinguished. The names they released into the human world were not fully recovered. They remained embedded in traditions, encoded in texts, preserved in the memories of lineages that survived every attempt to erase them. The Watchers themselves were bound, imprisoned beneath the earth according to Enoch, awaiting a judgment at the end of days. But the knowledge they had carried across the boundary between worlds was already loose, already moving through human history, already shaping events in ways that most people could not see because they did not know what they were looking at. You are looking at it now. And the question the tradition wants you to sit with is not whether the knowledge still exists. The question is whether the boundary it crossed was ever fully repaired. At some point in this story, you have to stop talking about the 72 names in the abstract and ask the question that every serious student of this material eventually has to confront. Not where the names came from, not who transmitted them or who was punished for receiving them, but what they actually do. Because the tradition is not vague on this point, even when it is careful. The Kabbalistic texts that survived the centuries of transmission, the ones that were copied in secret and studied in locked rooms and passed between teachers and students who understood the weight of what they were handling. These texts describe the function of each name with a specificity that goes far beyond spiritual metaphor. Each of the 72 names is said to activate a specific gate in the structure of reality, not a metaphorical gate, not a poetic description of a psychological state, a structural aperture in the architecture of creation through which a specific quality of divine energy moves, and through which a sufficiently prepared human consciousness can, in theory, reach. The tradition organizes the 72 names into groups, and the groups correspond to categories of operation that span the full range of what can happen in a human life. There are names associated with healing, with the restoration of a body or a mind to a state it had lost. There are names associated with protection, with the creation of a boundary around a person or a place that hostile forces cannot easily penetrate. There are names associated with clarity, with the removal of the confusion and spiritual static that the tradition says accumulates around a human consciousness the way dust accumulates on a surface left undisturbed. And then there are names that the texts discuss with a visible reluctance, names associated with judgment, with the imposition of consequences, with the kind of divine force that does not restore but removes. The tradition does not pretend these names do not exist. It acknowledges them with the careful tone of a doctor explaining that the same compound that kills an infection can, in the wrong dose, kill the patient. The Egyptian magical tradition, which absorbed the Watcher knowledge through the channels described in the previous account, developed what may be the most extensive practical system ever built around the use of divine names. The texts recovered from Egyptian temples and burial sites, what scholars now call the Greek magical papyri, are documents that most academic treatments of ancient religion treat with a kind of embarrassed awkwardness, acknowledging that they exist without quite knowing what to do with the fact that they are extraordinarily sophisticated. These are not the scrawled wishes of desperate peasants. These are structured technical documents written by people who understood the names they were invoking well enough to specify the precise conditions under which each invocation should be performed: the time of day, the orientation of the body, the specific sequence of sounds, the accompanying physical components. And scattered through these documents, sometimes transliterated into Greek letters but recognizable in their structure, are combinations of sounds that align with startling precision to the 72 names preserved in the Jewish mystical tradition. The knowledge that leaked through the watchers did not stay in one container. It spread across the ancient world, adapted to different languages and different ritual frameworks, but remained recognizable at its core. Now here is the detail that the tradition finds most troubling, the one that generates the deepest unease among those who have studied this material carefully. The names do not require belief to function. This is the claim that separates the 72 names from most other forms of sacred practice. And it is the claim that explains why the tradition treated their transmission with such extreme caution. In ordinary religious practice, the efficacy of prayer or ritual is understood to depend in some essential way on the faith, the intention, and the spiritual state of the person performing it. A prayer offered without sincerity is, in most frameworks, simply words moving through air. But the 72 names, according to the oldest layers of the tradition, operate more like a key than like a petition. A key does not care whether you believe in the door. It does not assess your moral character before deciding whether to turn. If the key matches the lock and the mechanism is engaged correctly, the door opens. The names work the same way, which means that a person of destructive intent, possessing the correct knowledge and the correct method, can use them just as effectively as a person of pure intention. And this is precisely why the transmission was protected so ferociously, and why Ben Stada's acquisition of the names outside the authorized chain was treated not merely as a moral failure, but as a genuine emergency. The rabbinic tradition records several cases, spoken about with deliberate incompleteness, of what happens when the names are used without the stabilizing framework of authorized transmission. There is the account of two students who used a name to create a calf and slaughter it for a Sabbath meal, recorded in the Talmud with a tone that suggests the rabbis found the incident deeply disturbing rather than simply transgressive. There is the account in the same tradition of individuals who used divine names to perform acts of apparent healing that the rabbis concluded were drawing on forces that were not operating within sanctioned boundaries. In each case, the concern is not the outcome alone, but the source. An act performed through unauthorized use of a divine name creates a connection between the human world and a level of reality that the human world was not designed to sustain indefinitely. The act may produce the intended result in the short term, but the connection it creates does not simply close again when the act is complete. It remains open, drawing energy in directions that the person who opened it cannot fully monitor or control, affecting not just the immediate situation, but the broader fabric of reality in ways that accumulate over time. And this brings us to the question that sits at the center of everything the tradition has been building toward. If the names are this powerful, if their misuse carries consequences this serious, if the transmission was protected with this degree of intensity across this many centuries, then why do the texts that describe them exist at all? Why did the rabbis who compiled the Talmud include the accounts of Ben Stada and the students who created the calf? Why did the authors of the Zohar describe the structure of the 72 names in enough detail that a sufficiently dedicated reader could begin to reconstruct the system? The answer the tradition gives is not comfortable, but it is consistent. The knowledge was preserved because it cannot be destroyed, and because knowledge that cannot be destroyed is safer in a context that provides warnings than in a vacuum that provides none. The texts that describe the names also describe what happens to those who misuse them. The warnings are not separate from the knowledge. They are woven into it, the way a label warning of poison is woven into the identity of the bottle that contains it. You are reading the label right now, and the final question, the one that the tradition has been moving toward since the very first verse of this account, is not whether the names still exist. It is whether the seal placed over the most dangerous of them, the name that was never fully transmitted even in the most protected of the authorized lineages, is still holding. Among the 72 names, there is one that the tradition never fully transmitted. This is not a matter of the texts being lost or the lineage being broken through historical accident. It is a deliberate withholding, a sealing that the Kabbalistic tradition describes not as a gap in the knowledge, but as a feature of it. The other 71 names were transmitted, protected, studied, and in some cases misused, their effects documented in the accounts that fill the margins of the Talmud and the layered commentaries of the Zohar. But this one name, identified in the tradition by its position rather than its content, was held back at a level above the human teachers who preserved everything else. The rabbis who knew about it did not claim to possess it. They claimed only to know that it existed, that it was real, that it corresponded to a gate in the structure of creation so fundamental that speaking it would not merely activate a specific divine force. It would, according to the tradition, initiate a process that cannot be reversed once begun. The texts that mention it do so with the brevity of people describing something they are genuinely afraid to describe in detail. The concept of a sealed name is not unique to the Jewish mystical tradition, and that convergence across independent sources is one of the most unsettling aspects of this entire account. In the Sumerian text recovered from the ancient city of Nippur, there are references to a divine name that was kept in the keeping of the highest gods and was never spoken aloud in any ritual, a name whose utterance was reserved for a moment described only as the time of the great turning. In the Egyptian tradition, the texts surrounding the god whose name is written as the four-letter word that scholars transliterate as Amun describe a hidden name beneath the spoken name, a true name that was never committed to hieroglyph because the act of writing it was considered sufficient to trigger effects that no living priest wanted to trigger. In the Vedic tradition of ancient India, the concept of the pranava, the primordial sound, describes a vibration so fundamental to the structure of reality that its full expression was considered accessible only at specific moments in the cosmic cycle, moments that do not occur within the span of an ordinary human lifetime. More than 200 distinct religious and mythological traditions, separated by oceans and centuries, describe the same basic architecture, a name that holds everything together, a name that was sealed, a name that waits. The Jewish tradition is the most specific about the conditions under which the sealed name will be spoken again. The texts that address this are not peripheral documents. They include passages in the book of Isaiah, in the prophetic literature of Ezekiel, and in the apocalyptic sections of Daniel, all of which describe a future moment in which the divine presence will reassert itself into human history in a way that goes beyond anything recorded in the past. The Hebrew prophets do not use the language of gradual improvement or slow spiritual progress when they describe this moment. They use the language of rupture, of a boundary being crossed in the final direction, of a reality being restructured at its foundation. And in the mystical commentary on these passages, the sealed name appears consistently as the mechanism through which that restructuring occurs. The name was not sealed to protect humanity from its power permanently. It was sealed to protect humanity from its power prematurely. There is a difference, and the tradition insists that the difference is everything. Now, bring this forward into the present moment, because the tradition is insistent that the present moment is precisely where this account has always been pointing. Jesus of Nazareth, in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verse 37, made a statement that the Jewish mystical tradition and the early Christian tradition both preserved as one of the most significant prophetic utterances in the record. He said that the days of the end would be like the days of Noah, not similar to the days of Noah in some loose metaphorical sense. Like them, in their specific character, in the quality of what was happening in the world during that period, and what was happening in the world during the days of Noah, according to everything the tradition has built across the previous accounts in this narrative, was a precise set of conditions. Knowledge that was not meant for human hands had entered the human world. The boundary between the divine structure of reality and the human experience of it had been compromised by a transmission that went outside the authorized channels. The fabric of creation was under a stress it was not designed to sustain, and the result was a world that looked from the outside like a civilization at the peak of its development, and was, from the inside, a system already past the point of self-correction. Look at the present world with that framework in your mind and sit with what you see. In the year 2003, scientists announced the completion of the Human Genome Project, the full mapping of the genetic sequence that defines human biology. Within 2 decades, the technology to edit that sequence had moved from theoretical possibility to practical application, used in laboratories on every inhabited continent, regulated imperfectly, advancing faster than the ethical frameworks designed to govern it. The specific intervention that the Watchers were condemned for, the mixing of what the tradition called the divine image in humanity with something outside its original design, is now a technical procedure available to researchers with access to the right equipment and the right funding. This is not an argument against, it is an observation about a pattern. The tradition does not say that technology is evil. It says that the introduction of capacities that exceed the moral and spiritual development of the beings using them creates instability at a structural level. It says this creates the precise conditions under which the sealed name moves from the category of the reserved to the category of the necessary. The story of Ben Stada did not end with his execution. The story of the Watchers did not end with their imprisonment beneath the earth. The story of the 72 names did not end with the flood, or with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, or with any of the other ruptures through which the tradition has passed while carrying this knowledge forward. The knowledge survived because it is woven into the structure of a text that has been copied by hand and printed and memorized by millions of people across 3,000 years, preserved with a fidelity that has no parallel in the history of human civilization. It survived because the tradition understood, at some level deeper than conscious decision, that a time was coming when the account would matter in a way that it had not mattered before. The name that was sealed is still sealed. The gate it corresponds to is still closed. But the tradition that preserved its existence did not do so for the benefit of scholars or mystics in previous centuries. It did so for whoever is alive at the moment, when the conditions that made sealing it necessary in the first place reassert themselves fully. The question that the tradition leaves open, the one it has been building toward since the first letter of the first verse of the book that contains the hidden code, is not academic. It is personal. It is immediate. And it is addressed with a precision that should disturb you if you have been paying attention directly to the moment you are living in right now.